back to my channel, Mental Health with Melissa. If you're new here, please hit that like and subscribe button for more content. I post new videos every single Sunday and Wednesday. Doing so really helps me reach our communities of color to provide mental health information and furthering breaking down that stigma, and tons of free LCSW test prep for those of you that are studying to be licensed clinical social workers or licensed clinical marriage and family therapists. I have a study program for that licensing exam down below in the description box, where you can receive tons of private videos and a complete study guide for the LCSW exam, including a full 170 question mock exam. So make sure that you check that out there, and there are videos to provide rationale for every single one of those questions, 170 questions. It took a very long time to do, but I was really excited to get it out there to you. So feel free to check that out. So today, what I wanted to do is go over some information with you about how to prevent that therapist stress or manage that therapist stress and anxiety. And when I say therapist, I kind of mean like if you're a mental health or behavioral health provider, whether you're a social worker, a marriage and family therapist, an LPC, a psychologist, or a behavioral therapist, whatever it is that you do in the mental health and behavioral health field, I really wanted to apply this video to you. So the reason why I'm doing this video is because I know and acknowledge firsthand as a therapist that there is a lot going on in the world. And as somebody that provides thousands of hours of therapy a year, I hear stories all day, every day from my clients, and a lot of it having to do with their personal experiences, of course, but also a lot of it having to do with things that are connected to what's going on in the world right now. Of course, we know about the Roe v. Wade and how that has changed for a majority of the United States population and how that's affecting individuals. We know of this ongoing sort of racial trauma that exists for BIPOC communities since the beginning of time, but the only difference now is that we have this access to media, and so we can see it much more often through our devices, right? Not just in person, so in person and through the media devices. So this is troubling in many ways. Also, though, I want to focus this really as a mental health provider, providing more psychoeducation to other mental health providers, because I know that this is a time right now where mental health providers are at all-time burnout rates. And I'm not saying that we all experience burnout, but we all do experience stress, whether you agree or disagree with that. Not all of us have anxiety, because anxiety is something that can sometimes lead to like actual mental health diagnosis. But at the end of the day, we do experience stress, and I wanted to really hone in on kind of talking about these things. So, the other thing too is that as a person of color myself, having access to a lot of media all the time, along with hearing stories from my clients, because a majority of my clients identify as BIPOC folks. And so I want to really talk about that and kind of how I've been able personally and professionally to manage hearing these stories and having all this access and stimulation to the media. So let's go ahead and get into it. I want to start with kind of defining key terms here, and I want to reference all of this information that I have written down here to this website. So they had really good definitions for vicarious trauma and secondary trauma. And so I want to definitely give them all the credit. So if you want to read further about these terms, then just go to this website here. For now, I want to go ahead and take a look at these terms and read them verbatim so that you have an idea while we're talking through some of these things. So vicarious traumatization, or VT, is a term to describe the profound shift in worldviews that occurs in helping professionals when they work with individuals who have experienced trauma. Helpers notice that their fundamental beliefs about the world are altered and possibly damaged by being repeatedly exposed to traumatic material. A domestic violence shelter worker may stop being able to believe that any relationship can be healthy. A child abuse investigator may lose trust in anyone who approaches their child. Again, examples of this abound and vary based on the type of work that we do. So what we see here with vicarious trauma is when there is a helper, say, again, we're using this example of the domestic violence shelter worker, who may be exposed to trauma on a daily basis because all of the clients that they're working with 40 hours a week are telling them that their relationships are violent, of course. And so this worker may really start to fear that there's really no healthy relationships, and this may even affect their idea of the world and their personal relationships, right? Maybe they may not feel comfortable going on dates anymore because of this vicarious traumatization that they are kind of in this revolving door. So this doesn't happen to everybody, of course, but it can happen. And I think when we are aware and we kind of understand the complexities to these sorts of things, then we have a better way of intervening and stopping it at the source. So now let's take a look at secondary traumatic stress, because it's different. So it's a concept that was developed by a trauma specialist, or a few of them, and it was developed by these professionals because they wanted to understand why these providers were exhibiting symptoms that were similar to PTSD without having been exposed to the direct trauma themselves. So secondary traumatic stress can occur in professionals who work in high stress and trauma exposed fields. So you can see that there, but it can also affect civilians who do not work in high trauma fields but are deeply impacted by stories that they are exposed to. So really, the differences between the vicarious trauma and the secondary traumatic stress is that in secondary traumatic stress, it seemed as though the workers were really exhibiting the PTSD symptoms, whereas in the vicarious trauma, it seems as though there's more of that burnout and compassion fatigue that makes it challenging to believe in healthy relationships or in healthy livelihoods, for example. So again, this can happen with providers in the social service field and the mental health field. However, it doesn't happen all the time. It helps us to know, though, what these terms mean and that they do happen, so that if we start to feel certain things or start to have shifts in our thinking, that we can be aware that it may be going into a territory that we want to acknowledge and that we want to stop from the get-go, right? And so these things actually have happened to me in the past, and I think that they've happened to a lot of my colleagues as well. And again, as somebody that has provided thousands of hours of therapy and social work services in the past few years, I can definitely attest to this. And what I had to do in my own experience was, and I want to go over these things with you now as tips. So the number one tip, as I already mentioned, would be to be aware of kind of your feelings and really noticing when you're starting to get more stressed out, right? And so when that comes up, really taking the time to maybe either process it in therapy with your own therapist, because as therapists, we need therapists, right? And we need to know what it's like to be on both sides of the couch, sort of thing. or consult with a colleague about your client cases and about how you're feeling in relation to them. Because as I always mention, countertransference is not a bad thing. All mental health providers, whether we agree with it or not, experience countertransference in some way or another. And that's not the bad thing. The bad thing is when we choose to not acknowledge that we are having the countertransference and not talk about it. So if you're not licensed, then you should have your clinical supervisor or your administrative supervisor, hopefully, that you can process kind of the countertransference with, or process what is going on with your clients and how it's affecting you if you're not experiencing the countertransference. And so that would be the first tip. Now, the second tip, again, like I was mentioning at the beginning of this video, is the fact that we have so much access to what's going on in the world right now through our media. So through news sources, through our apps on our phone, through social media, through the TV. And this is both a blessing and a curse, I think, because we have the ability to know in a matter of seconds or minutes what has happened in a complete opposite end of the world, where before maybe it would have taken like a few weeks or a few months to get that on a newspaper. We have the ability to keep ourselves informed. And I really want to make this a point to not get confused that there's a difference between being informed and managing the amount of stimulation we're getting from social media sources versus being completely ignorant to it and keeping it away from us. So these are two very different sorts of scenarios that I'm talking about. And I really want to emphasize tip 2 on staying informed, however, limiting the media that you're absorbing throughout your week or throughout your day. And you can do this by the alerts that you get or the notifications that you get on your phone. So I have all sorts of apps on my phone, CNN, NPR, of course, like social media, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. And I had to go into my phone and take off the notifications because every single sort of article or news brief update that was coming up on CNN would ping me. And I still do take the time out of my week to look at the news, but now I have compartmentalized it where I can set aside a certain time of the week to do that so I can stay informed, because again, it's very important to stay informed and empowered, but I don't let it run my life. I don't let the constant pings take over my life anymore. And so that has been really helpful, and especially with the racial trauma that exists for BIPOC communities and BIPOC people, because I will use myself as an example, but I know that there are many people that experience racial trauma, and there may be better examples, but for privacy concerns and to kind of just give an example, I'll use myself. So as a woman of color myself, and somebody that identifies as Filipina American, as Asian American, the COVID-19 pandemic has been rough, man. I'll tell you that much. Because with the COVID-19 pandemic has come an increase in Asian hate crimes. And this is something that has been proven through data, through statistics, and we see it every day on the news since the start of the pandemic. I was getting the notifications every single minute of every single day on my apps on my phone when it started happening. There have been several Chinese Americans, Chinese immigrants, Filipinos that have been assaulted on the streets of New York, on the streets of other places in the United States. And these have been, or even killed, and these have been specifically hate-based crimes. So the assaulters were specifically looking to assault Filipinos or Asian individuals or Asian people, that have like Asian descent. And so seeing this every single day really made me fear for not only my own life, but also for my family and people in my community or others that identify as Asians. And so having that constant influx was very stimulating for me. It made it challenging for me to think about going outside and maybe going to some of these areas where there may be large Asian populations because they may be targeted. And the same can be said for many other marginalized communities, communities of color, for our LGBTQ populations. And so keeping these things in mind, again, we want to stay informed, but having like that influx of stimulation and information can be very depleting and can wear one down. So what I did is I made it, a very proactive choice to take off those notifications. So I'm not seeing, all of the different types of assaults that are happening all across the world, right? And so that is, in a nutshell, actually what racial trauma is. I hate to put it in a nutshell because it's so much more than that, but racial trauma is this concept that you have similar sorts of symptoms as PTSD, but the difference with the racial trauma is that it doesn't end. The experiences of the trauma don't end because you're exposed to them through the media or through personal interactions in your daily life. So we're not saying that they don't happen and that we can take away the experiences, but what we can do is we can limit the exposure through media. And so that has helped me tremendously because a lot of my clients do come to me with racial trauma. And when I take away the notifications that are happening of race-based crime on my phone, I can have the amount of energy that I need to be fully present and not experience that compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma and be fully there for my clients when they're telling me about their experiences and how they're experiencing racial trauma or any other sorts of microaggressions. And that has been really helpful. So that was a mouthful for the second tip, but I really wanted to make sure that I could expand off of that because I think that's a huge part of our job. And, the same thing can be said about, again, the Roe v. Wade being overturned and, being able to be there for the clients, but process how it's affecting us in our clinical supervision, our own therapy, and limiting our exposure to what is available to us on the news. So the third thing that I would say as a tip to do to really manage your stress is make sure that you're including some sort of physical activity or some sort, if you have physical or functional limitations, some sort of hobby that brings you joy. So for me, as an example, I make it a point to set aside a certain day of the week to do an outside activity. Every single week, no matter how busy I am, if I'm only able, I try to work out at least 5 times a week. A lot of that will be indoor workouts like on the Peloton. But for me, when I get outside and I get fresh air, there's something that is so rejuvenating about that to me. And it's proven by science, doing physical activity and being outside helps really boost those serotonin levels and helps alleviate a lot of that stress that we may experience. And so that's something that I really love doing. I look forward to it. And so when I'm having a really heavy week with whether it be having a lot of clients or the sort of trauma work that I'm doing with clients is really heavy, then I know that on Saturday at 10 a.m., I am going to hit that mountain and go hiking. And that brings me so much peace just knowing that I have that waiting for me. And it can be other things for you. You can have your week full of clients and of work and know that you love doing pottery and you have a pottery session scheduled for Friday at 2 p.m. And that's what you're really excited to do, and you're looking forward to that, because when we have that on the agenda and we know that we're going to do that, then that brings us that fulfillment. And so that leads me to my last tip, which is to talk to your loved ones and really make sure that you're feeling supported by them and you're not isolating. So something that has come about obviously in this COVID pandemic is the notion to need to have that social distance. And while of course very important, it has created a lot of isolation and loneliness with individuals. And so we really want to make sure that we're staying connected to our loved ones and having conversations with them, whether they be not so easy conversations about how you're really feeling, or even just being able to have those good times with them as well. So you're really gonna wanna stay connected in that capacity. But I hope this was a helpful video for you. I really thought that it was important to talk about these things. Managing stress should be something that as mental health and behavioral therapists, we prioritize. A lot of the time it's hard to practice what we preach, especially in our profession, but it helps us be better healers, listeners, interventionists with our populations that we're serving when our cup is full itself. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, managing mental health matters.